All right, Chris Peaks here again with my man Lucas Wilder. I'm always ready for these exciting chats, and tonight we're going to talk about the Battle of Shiloh. Lucas, how are you, my man?
I'm doing great, Chris. I'm looking forward to this discussion. It's quickly become one of my favorite battles of all time is the Battle of Shiloh.
Is it fair to say that the Battle of Shiloh was the pivotal turning point of the Civil War?
I wouldn't go that far, but it definitely was um, one of the more bloody battles. You can talk about Gettysburg, you can talk about Chickamauga, but when you read about the accounts of these gentlemen just slugging it out with one another and fairly inexperienced, it's incredible what these two sides did to one another over the course of 2 days in April. And so I put it right up there with one of the more bloody battles of the Civil War as being like just reading about the carnage is is tremendous.
Is that, would you say that that battle brought it to people's living rooms, so to speak? Did they realize how just a slugfest this was?
It absolutely did. That's one of the biggest implications for the Battle of Shiloh was that it signaled to everybody that this was going to be a very, very bloody war. First Manassas was, I mean, it was a big battle compared to what the United States had been involved in previously, but
Mhm.
it did not have the slaughter that Shiloh had with it. I know we're kind of jumping ahead to the end, but about 24, 25,000 casualties over the course of 2 days. That stunned the nation. And when you go ahead.
Christopher Steve was talking about this other night. I mean, essentially, you had, two armies that, had never been that size before. The Mexican army was 13,000 men, and you had relatively new commanders that was kind of bumbling around. I mean, not really knowing what to do. I mean,
Yeah, well,
that been a fair statement?
let's explore that because when last time we talked about Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, and that
Mm-hmm.
just created a chain reaction, a domino effect. And once Fort Henry and Fort Donelson were captured by the Union forces, the Confederates in the West had to start pulling back, and they had to give up the capital at Nashville, and they moved into northern Mississippi. So we get Albert Sidney Johnston has collected all of his forces around Corinth, Mississippi, and the Union Army is moving into West Tennessee. He starts collecting all these forces from all over the Confederacy, trying to stymie, blunt any attack that's going to be coming south by Ulysses S. Grant. Um, Halleck actually
Would it be
replaces Grant with Charles F. Smith, but Grant will go back in command. I mean, these troops that come to Johnston are coming from all the way from Pensacola.
yeah?
Braxton Bragg's force down in Pensacola is making his way to Corinth.
I mean, would it be fair to say that, I mean, Johnston showed the importance of concentration in this battle?
It will be fair to say was he showed the capability of concentrating forces in the Civil War. I would dare
Well,
say that no other army that quickly had brought together that many forces in that amount of time.
first of all, I will explore this right here because I mean, why was the Confederacy spread, all over high heaven? I mean, they had troops in Kentucky, they had troops in Eastern Tennessee, like you said, Pensacola. I mean, they were spread all over the place. I mean, why did they let I mean, was that crossroads that vital that they let the Union Army march unmolested all the way through Tennessee until
Well,
they,
that's actually a really important part. And if you remember back to when we discussed my dissertation, I actually touch on that with my dissertation is the Confederate departmental system. The Confederacy is divided up into all these different sections, and every section has a small army. Many times it could be as small as a few thousand men, it could be as many as 20,000. And the idea was if that a Union force moved into Tennessee, let's say Tennessee, Missouri, Arkansas, if they moved into those areas, then those departmental systems were supposed to concentrate together, work together to defeat the enemy, and then disperse. Because
Mhm.
it's hard to sustain an army in one place for so long. especially
Right.
a large one. So that was the idea. That's the reason that they're having to come from so far away, is because that was the design. That's what Jefferson Davis had implemented when the war began, was this departmental system. I argue in my dissertation it actually worked in East Tennessee. There's a really well thought out plan. But once we start moving into the war and Union forces are able to mobilize huge forces on multiple fronts, that plan does not work.
Well, I think it was uh, General Eisenhower said, all battle plans are great until the first shots were fired.
And I think that's one of the a great example, a great thing to say when we're talking about the Battle of Shiloh,
Yeah.
because Johnston is in a weird predicament. He's getting all these forces, and it's a huge hulking force, but no one has ever maneuvered an army together like that. We see at First Manassas, the forces are 30, 35,000 men. Now we're moving into Johnston having about 40,000, and Grant's got a total of 60 if you count in Buell's army, which has not quite reached him at this point. So
Now, how many?
it's a different.
Oh, I'm sorry. How many troops did, or how long? I'm sorry. How long did it take Johnston to concentrate these 40,000 troops at Corinth, Mississippi?
Well, Fort Henry and Fort Donelson fall in February.
Mm-hmm.
He moves by March. He's already near in Corinth, and so he's amassing these together in the realm of around a month. He's putting all these forces together.
So he made a decision and put it in act and went with it.
Yeah, him working in conjunction with Jefferson Davis and PGT Beauregard, who was sent west to kind of help Johnston. Beauregard was supposed to work kind of in tandem with Johnston, and they kind of are co-commanders. Um, Johnston is the overall commander, but Beauregard is responsible for some of the more grander schemes, we'll call it that. When the Confederate, well, let's talk about Grant, who's coming up the Tennessee River. He's trying to find a landing to put his army, and he's looking
Mm-hmm.
at a few different landings. Sherman finds Pittsburgh Landing, which he tells Grant. Well, it's actually Smith at the time. Halleck has replaced Grant with Charles F. Smith. Tells him that this is the best one that can sustain all of our ships, all of our boats that are coming up the river. This is the only landing that's going to be able to handle all that traffic.
Okay.
So they start landing at Pittsburgh Landing, and that becomes the designation point. Um, Smith will get replaced by Grant, and Grant's force is not all up and concentrated yet. Buell's army is still coming up, and we've still got Lew Wallace, that's part of the Army of Tennessee, Army of the Tennessee. Grant does not have his whole force. Johnston hears about this. He knows that they are just a few miles away. I mean, Corinth and Shiloh are not that very far apart if you've ever been to it. And he knows that Grant is not all up and concentrated yet. That's what forces him to move. His troops needed to be trained. They were
Mm-hmm.
way too inexperienced to be moving into a battle this large, but he was working against time. If he was going to defeat Grant, he was going to have to move quickly. And so when he starts moving his troops towards Pittsburgh Landing, it's PGT Beauregard who has organized this march, and it's a horrible march. The men are having to march, counter march, trying to get into the position that Beauregard wanted them in. Beauregard has these grand ideas and these grand schemes. They make it all the way up to within less than a mile of the Union Army, and Beauregard starts talking about maybe pulling back and retreating because he thinks the element of surprise is gone because all the Confederate Army, it's moving against the Union Army, and all kinds of animals are moving through the through the Union camps. They know something's there. Skirmishers have met elements of the Confederate Army. Union cavalry have encountered Cleburne's brigade. I mean, the Union Army knows there's something out there, and Beauregard mentions, "Hey, maybe we should pull back." And it's Johnston that says, "I would fight them if they were a million." At that point, I mean, there's no turning back at this point. And his plan, when he's going to engage the Union Army, is he wants to hit their far eastern flank and drive
Mm-hmm.
them away from the Tennessee River, drive them away from their gunboats, because that's going to be
Oh,
the
okay.
ticket. That's the plan. And so
So that's a pretty sound plan.
It
I
is.
mean,
It's
on
a good
paper.
plan. On paper, it's a wonderful plan because once you get them away from the gunboats, then they're away from any kind of help because
Hmm.
it's Buell that is across the river. And if you can get between the two armies and defeat one, and then you can move on to the another one. Great plan. And it's Beauregard who comes up with this great scheme, and it's almost like the Battle of Stones River, where you're moving an entire army in a maneuver, which is, I mean, this is for 40,000 men you're trying to coordinate in a single thrust. This is incredible, and it's
Forty
Beauregard.
thousand men in a single thrust that was trying to coordinate it.
Yeah,
I didn't realize that.
they're trying to coordinate roughly 40,000 men into one major assault. I mean,
Really?
this is incredible, and Beauregard puts this together. And of course, as you just said, battle plans are wonderful until the first shots are fired. So let's run into that first little piece of the battle when Beauregard his men are formed up in a northwest to southeast formation.
Hmm.
And so that means the far left end of the line needs to move very slowly while the right swings out and starts to move the Union Army away from the river. Well, similar to what happened at Stones River, the far left, which is Cleburne's brigade, actually shoots up, going north, and encounters Sherman's troops very quickly. And again, when all plans are great until the first shots are fired. The first shots are fired, and Claiborne is running up against Sherman's division, and he's kind of alone there for a little while until the rest of the army can swing northward. So again, we're moving 40,000 men against the Union army, and
It's
Sherman is
almost
the.
fantastic. Oh,
Go
sorry.
ahead.
That we've touched so many times. You know, it's impossible to have command and control of that. I mean, how do you coordinate that? I mean, they don't have walkie talkies or radio sets. I mean, how do you coordinate that?
And we'll find out it's not an easy task. I mean, almost I would dare say close to impossible task to actually try to do. And
Especially with separate commanders.
hmm and
I mean, I
because
understand
you
have one person can do it, but yeah, I'm sorry. You know,
no, Johnston and Beauregard have four core commanders. So we've got Hardee, we've got Polk, we've got Bragg, and we got Breckinridge. And
okay.
so Breckinridge is the reserve. He's not supposed to go in until something major happens. Well, on the Confederate left, Hardee and Polk are moving against the Confederate left. I mean, the Union right. Confederate left is moving against the Union right, and Claiborne's having a hard time. It's called the Valley of Death. The Confederates are going up against this stable Union line. When we hear about
Right.
the Battle of Shiloh, most people kind of talk about the battle as, well, the Confederates pushed them all the way back to the Pittsburgh Landing the first day, and then they got pushed back the second. Pretty simple. This was a knockdown, drag out fight, even at the early stages, even before the Hornet's Nest and the Peach Orchard, which have become synonymous with the Battle of Shiloh. It was a dog eat dog fight right there at the beginning stages.
So how many
Eventually,
people did Grant have at the start?
at the start, he's running somewhere just less than 40,000 when the battle starts.
Okay.
Johnston
So
has
they're
has 40,000, so the Confederates outnumber him initially, not by
okay.
much, but initially, yes. And Sherman is actually outflanked. When he gets outflanked, there exposes a huge gap in the Union line. I mean, the Confederate line. They have actually pushed the far western portion of the Union line back towards the landing instead of away from it. And so now we've got this huge gap in the Confederate line because you can't coordinate 40,000 men.
Wow.
And right there in the center, there's a huge gap, and so they throw Breckinridge near the center and to the right. So here they are moving north towards Pittsburgh Landing.
So how many hours has taken place so far? I mean, in
So
this fight.
far, we're running about 2 or 3 hours into the battle. They started at dawn, and
Okay, and
now
they're just like two heavyweight fighters going toe to toe.
this is about mid morning that
Okay.
fighting breaks out. Once Sherman's line is turned, he moves back towards a place called the Crossroads. Him and McClernand put up a stiff resistance at the Crossroads. Around the same time, we're also seeing defensive positions being set up by Union forces, um, around what's called the Sunken Road, or the Hornet, what will become the Hornet's Nest, and the Peach Orchard.
Mhm.
As they're moving against the Union line, this is where it's going to be probably the most really the most stubborn, where Sherman and McClernand are holding on the Union right, and we've got Prentiss, Hurlbut, and W.H.L. Wallace that are holding on the Union left.
Okay.
Eventually, the Confederates are actually going to be outflanking them to the east, and it's going to force them to move. But the Peach Orchard and the Hornet's Nest, I suspect most people want to hear us talk about that because
Yeah.
that's one of the more famous parts. But I wanted to highlight some less known, like the Crossroads and the Valley of Death.
I'd like to hear about, because I don't know much about the Crossroads or the Valley of Death. Those was newness to me.
Yeah, well, Valley of Death, it was Sherman's first stand. So this is the dawn
Mhm.
attack. This is Sherman is not even sure what's happening at the moment. He goes out to actually investigate the front line, and his aide gets killed and he gets wounded right there, meeting some of Claiborne's men.
Hey, let me ask
And
you a question.
sure.
Because we talked about how this brought the war to basically people's living room. They realized the brutality. Did the soldiers and commanders also realize this? Hey, this thing is going to be bloody. I mean, they didn't know how this was going to be going into this, did they?
They didn't have any recollection of the scope, and
Right.
I think they had ideas of grandeur, and that
Okay.
I go back to Beauregard, thinking he was going to maneuver 40,000 men in one fell swoop and one nice swing.
Okay.
They had big ideas, but once the battle's over, they realize it's much more difficult to eliminate an entire army than what they thought. The only way you're going to eliminate an entire army is if you are able to lay siege and capture it. That only happens a few times, and Grant is usually the man who captures these whole armies.
Well, why did that happen in Napoleonic? I mean, does it have to do with the rifling of the muskets and cannons? I mean, because Napoleon, destroyed many armies.
I can only speak
I
from the
had,
Civil War perspective, but it's like the Army of Tennessee. After the Battle of Franklin, yeah, it's beaten up and nearly destroyed, but you can't say it's completely destroyed because it
Mhm.
reforms. The problem is you can't eliminate every single soldier unless you capture a garrison. Um,
Right.
there's always stragglers that are moving, and when we talk about the Battle of Shiloh, I'll use Claiborne as an example because right now I'm in the middle of my Claiborne biography on my
Yeah, I'm
YouTube
enjoying
channel.
that.
Claiborne at the Battle of Shiloh, after near the end of the day, Claiborne has went from 2,700 men, so 2,700 men, to about 600.
God, in one day. I
Yeah,
mean,
in a couple of hours.
a couple of
Now,
hours.
in a couple hours. Now, that does not mean that those are killed, wounded. Many of
Right.
those have gotten lost on the battlefield and can't find their unit.
Really.
So, because once he gets back to his unit, he's still got somewhere around. Once he goes back to Corinth, he's got somewhere around 1,200 men. So he's lost over half, but not as much as he thought. And even by the very end of the battle, Claiborne has about 60, 70 men that he's actually commanding out of the 2,700 he began with.
60 or 70 men, he's still commanding out of 2,700.
Yes, and again, not all those are not
Right.
dead and wounded. Many of those are simply getting lost on the battlefield. Don't know where they're at. They lose connection with their army. Some are scared. Some are deserting on the field as it's happening.
So
And
what's going on? Are they reporting back? I mean, to the War departments in Richmond and D.C. as this is unfolding?
it'll they send word back after the first day, and we'll talk
Okay.
about that once we get to the end of the
Okay.
first day. Um, but yeah, the Valley of Death, the Crossroads, very important part where Sherman and McClernand are holding the Union line for as long as they can, but the Confederate line is just simply longer than theirs, and so they're getting outflanked. They pull back from the Crossroads, but Grant is sending word to Sherman saying, "I need time. You need to buy me as much time as possible because we're still getting troops in on the landing." Grant had not even had his full force out in those advanced positions. And so what he's doing is telling Sherman, McClernand, Hurlbut, Prentiss, and W.H.L. Wallace, just hold out as long as you can, because the longer you hold out, the more chance that I have to send troops to your aid. And so that's what Sherman and McClernand do. They actually get pushed away from the crossroads and then do a counterattack just to buy Grant some more time.
So if Grant doesn't, see, that's what when I asked him earlier about this being important. I mean, they could have been pushed into the river. I mean, if he gets pushed into the river over the first day, I mean, what does this do? I mean, maybe I'm jumping ahead with that question right there. I mean, I don't mean to get ahead, but it seems like this was a very pivotal touch and go moment for him.
It was, and he's running all over the battlefield. He's not only just at the landing; he's actually going up onto the front line and seeing what's happening with his own eyes.
Okay.
He's very involved, and when he's around Pittsburgh Landing, he is in his element. He is directing troops to different locations. If you want to see Grant at one of his best, even though the first day is very hectic and very destructive for the Union Army, Grant is performing very well. I mean, he's holding the entire Union Army together. And granted, he has some, no pun intended, granted, he has some really great commanders who are doing what he's asking them to do. I'm not saying McClernand was a great commander, but he was capable of doing what Grant was wanting him to. Now,
Okay.
once Sherman and McClernand eventually get pushed back from the crossroads and they're moving their flank back, there's still some very stubborn Union forces, and that's where we get the Hornet's Nest and the Peach Orchard. Some of the bloodiest fighting of the battle actually happens at the Peach Orchard and the Hornet's Nest. The Hornet's Nest, of course, if those who don't know, is the Union Army are on one side of a field, the Confederate Army is on the other. The Confederates are trying repeatedly attack and attack and attack across this field and are unable to budge the Union forces inside of this thicket. But the Union forces comment that the bullets that are flying from the Confederate guns sound like hornets going over their heads. They're buzzing by their heads, and so it gets the name the Hornet's Nest. The man who's in charge of the Hornet's Nest is Bragg. Once we move once the Union Army has moved that far, all these units are mishmashed. The Confederates are not holding up that well, and so what they eventually do, Beauregard and Johnston will say, "Okay, Hardee, you've got this sector. Polk, you've got this sector. Bragg, you've got here, and Breckinridge, you've got here. You may not even be commanding your own troops." That you started the battle with, but you're in charge of this sector here. And so Bragg was in charge of the Confederate sector at the Hornet's Nest. And he's ordering brigade after brigade to hit this Union emplacement, and every time they're getting pushed back and pushed back and pushed back. The reason they're holding so well is because their left flank is holding so well. The Union left flank is at the Peach Orchard. And the Peach Orchard, they're also holding out very well. They're getting hit by about 3 or 4 Confederate brigades and repeated assaults against this Peach Orchard across what's called the Old Cotton Field. Johnston knows that this is the left flank of the Union Army. He's got to push it away. He's got to break it. He even takes a regimental flag and leads part of the way across this cotton field. The commander of the entire army leading them across this field, trying to get them to break the Union line. It's an amazing story, but unfortunately, it's Johnston who running so close to the Peach Orchard, trying to get his men to break, is when he gets shot in the back of the leg. Now, there's some different stories, but apparently he didn't know he was hit. Apparently, he had some numbness in that leg and never knew he was hit, and he bled out and just slumps over on his horse, and his aides help him off his horse, and he dies right there on the battlefield.
Let me ask you a question. Because I had a discussion with somebody the other night. Jefferson Davis said, that was a turning point, losing him. I mean, why do people say that Johnston was the Robert E. Lee of the West? I mean, I think that's an unfair statement. I mean, to put that title on him in such a long time, it was phenomenal concentrating that. But I mean, he could have been a horrible commander.
I don't know any scholar that would say that he was that great. We don't know. Honestly, I mean that's the bare fact. We don't know how good or bad or he would have been.
I
Um,
mean, to me,
he
he exercised poor judgment just in fact that he led a regimental charge and he's the commander of the entire army.
well, Lee attempted to do the same thing.
Well, but
So
in all fairness, though, I mean, Lee was they was within minutes of breaking the line, and I think Lee just kind of got caught up in the moment when the Texas Brigade showed up and was going with them. I mean, I mean, maybe that was what Johnston did. I just view that as different. Maybe it wasn't, but what's your thoughts on it?
Well, Johnson, reason he does the leads the men himself is because he knows how important this spot is, and he's having trouble getting the men to move on, trying to get them to
Okay,
push on. It's do or die. He knows that he's got this part of the battlefield. He's overseeing this, and if they can't budge the Union left flank, then the Confederate left flank, which is moving on north, is going to be outstretched and could be defeated. He's fighting against time as well. He's got to push towards, he's got to push Grant and possibly push him into the river now that his plans have kind of went haywire from what they originally were.
okay. Maybe I
Both
was a little
men,
unfair with him in my original thinkings on him leading that regimental charge. So
yeah,
yeah,
knowing the stakes that were involved at the Peach Orchard, you understand why Johnston is wanting to break this line so badly.
yeah, I
And
can see it. Totally in a different light now that you explained it that way. What I originally just thought he was just trying to be uh, a grandeur hero, leading the brigade charge. I didn't know that it was like you said, do or die.
mhm. And the Peach Orchard, if you ever get a chance, it's one of the more neat parts of the battlefield. And behind the Peach Orchard, north of the Peach Orchard, is the Bloody Pond. Union soldiers are being wounded by the scores in the Peach Orchard, and they're crawling back trying to get to some water that's behind the Peach Orchard, which is there's this little pond, a great place to get water at. But
Bloody pond.
so many wounded are crawling to this pond that it gets filled up with blood, and now it's called the Bloody Pond because eventually you were unable to drink any of the water out of it because it was so full and contaminated.
Oh,
Um, Now, eventually, this is after Johnston is killed. The Confederates finally overrun the Peach Orchard. They're finally able to turn the flank, but the Hornet's Nest is still held by the Union. They can't budge the Hornet's Nest. What happens is the Confederate flanks basically encircle the Union forces that are defending the Hornet's Nest and essentially capture a large portion of those Union troops that defend the Hornet's Nest. That's a huge blow to the Union because now they have lost a lot of troops. And W.H.L. Wallace has been horribly wounded. His wife is actually at Pittsburgh Landing. She has came to visit her husband, not knowing no one knew a battle was going to erupt, but she came to visit her husband, and he's been shot in the head. He's not dead, but he's been shot in the head and basically left for dead in the Hornet's Nest. They will actually
wow.
find him the next day and send him back to Pittsburgh Landing, which uh, his wife is very happy to see him, although he does not survive. But the Peach Orchard has been taken now by the Confederates. The Hornet's Nest is being taken by the Confederates, and now the Confederates are moving north. And Grant has cobbled together a huge, a great defensive line. All of his artillery, his staff has assembled this great line of artillery that's going to be very difficult for any Confederate troops to be able to fight back against. And the Confederate troops are exhausted. There's they make some light assaults against the major assaults that happen by the Confederates is actually on the left, but nothing as large as what was happening, and it was getting dark. And so Grant has survived the first day. He has cobbled together a defensive line, and he's finally able to kind of rest easy for the moment. But he knows that
So
Lew Wallace is on the way, and he knows that Buell is going to be arriving momentarily.
who took command? Beauregard after
Beauregard
Johnson went
takes
down.
command. Yeah. And that night, Beauregard wires Jefferson Davis, telling him that they have just won a great victory and they'll finish the job tomorrow.
That's
Conversely,
when he wired Jefferson Davis.
yes. And conversely, Grant and Sherman will meet on the battlefield that night. And Sherman will say, "Man, we've basically saying we've had a rough day today." And Grant says, "Yeah, we'll whip them tomorrow, though." And I just love that confidence of Grant.
I mean,
You know,
yeah, well, you gotta love. I mean, admire that. Yeah, we'll get him tomorrow.
yeah, whip them tomorrow, though.
Well,
And
so what's going through Davis's mind when he goes to bed? I mean, he's got to be, pumped up, motivated.
Davis is happy as a lark. I mean, he's very proud that his Confederate forces have been able to defeat a Union force right out in the open.
And
But
in his home state.
yeah, well, no, Jefferson Davis'
Yeah,
home state is Kentucky.
right. Yeah, I meant where he was but he was a senator from Mississippi, right?
Senator from Mississippi, yes.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I said that wrong.
But throughout the night, Buell is arriving. He's moving across the Tennessee River, and he is going to be taking up a huge position across just north of the Deal Branch. Also reinforced during the night is reinforcing Grant during the night is Lew Wallace, who's finally made it to the battlefield. And now Grant has, without the casualties of the first day, that would have been about 60,000 men total that Grant would have had. Of course, the casualties from the first day reduce that number, but even then, on the battlefield, now he's got a superior number to the Confederates. And during the night, he asks for the gunboats to fire into the battlefield, and just to keep the Confederates awake to some extent. There's a couple of different reasons you do that, but one of them is just keep them on edge, and also make sure that they're not going to be coming after them in a night attack of some sort. It's Forrest who Nathan Bedford Forrest. He's only a colonel at this point, but during the night, Beauregard does not reinforce his lines. He actually requests most of his men to actually pull back. Only one brigade is actually on the front lines for the Confederates when the morning breaks on the second day. One brigade against around over 50,000 men that the Union have put together during the night. And Forrest is on the south end of the battlefield near Dill Branch, and he reports saying they've got reinforcements and they're coming, but no one listens. No one listens to him. Other Confederates are saying that as well. It's not just Forrest. Pond's brigade, which is the only one, again, the only infantry brigade that's left on the front lines, says they're coming. They're here, and Beauregard kind of waves it off. And once, well, the second day is a very slow start. Grant has got to move this again. We're moving huge armies, 50,000 men. We're trying to coordinate in a movement. Grant's army has been bloodied horribly. They're not moving very quickly at all. Buell moves south. By the time all the Union forces get into position for their attack that Grant has ordered to happen, it's almost 10 o'clock in the morning. It's taken some of them 2 or 3 hours to get in position, sometimes moving less than a mile. I mean, this is a very slow movement on the second day. Beauregard had plenty of time to actually cobble together a defensive position. But by this point, the Confederates are strewn all over the battlefield. There are units in every place. Say it again.
Is Beauregard still thinking at this point he's won?
Yeah, he still thinks he can do it.
Okay.
He does not know that Buell has reinforced him, even though I think it was Forrest that told him, he's got reinforcements. It's probably Buell that has came across the river, because this is another army. There's 2 Union armies now he's having to face, not just one like the day before.
Okay.
The fighting that breaks out, it almost is the exact same thing that happens from the first day, just in reverse. And it's really odd in that respect. But the Confederates have this weird line of men. Their defensive north to south, and then juts over to the west near the bottom, or juts over to the east near the bottom of the line. It's a weird formation, and because Buell is moving faster and hasn't been bloodied from the day before, he encounters the Union Confederate forces first, and he runs into them roughly around the same place as the peach orchard the day before. And that begins the sequence of events of about exactly what happened the day before, where the Confederates are trying to budge the Union forces away from the peach orchard, and the Union forces likewise are doing counterattacks, trying to break the men at the peach orchard. The men in the center and part of Buell's right flank are actually in the Hornet's Nest. Again, the same position the Union forces have held again. Some of Buell's men find W.H.L. Wallace and send him back to Pittsburgh Landing at that point. The far left of the Confederate line is in the air. It's not anchored on any point. It's near Jones Field.
Wow.
And Lew Wallace has came down from the north and is now going to be flanking that entire Confederate left flank. And that's what he does. They move across Tilghman Branch and slam into the Confederate forces. They're actually holding really well. That second day, if it hadn't been for Lew Wallace, and I'm not giving Lew Wallace a whole lot of credit because he had some problems. It took him 3-4 hours to get in position for one thing, and that was moving about a half a mile to 3/4 of a mile. It took him that long to do.
Oh.
However, the Confederate line was holding. Grant.
So they came down behind. I mean, almost behind the Confederate line, the Union Army.
Essentially, they did. Grant's initial attacks on that second day do not budge the Confederate forces. They are cobbled together. There are regiments that are miles away from their brigades. Brigades are out of their divisions, their corps. It is a conglomeration of troops. However,
so
poorly coordinated, but they're holding. Miraculously, they're actually holding. One of the things that happens before Lew Wallace makes his attack from the north is Beauregard wants to try to break the Union line, or at least stop it from advancing so quickly. And so he actually orders Breckinridge's corps to attack. On the far left of Breckinridge's corps is Cleburne's brigade. Cleburne's men are horribly bloodied at that point, and Bragg is the man who is it's Bragg and Breckinridge are kind of over those sectors, and Bragg orders Cleburne to move in, to advance with Breckinridge, and Cleburne says, I don't want to. The enemy is going to far overlap my own men or my own line, and it's not going to be good. Bragg says that's an order and you've got to do it. And so he does. His men get tore to pieces even more, and he kind of resents Bragg ever since. During the Battle of Shiloh, on the first day, Bragg's horse gets shot between the eyes. We can only imagine what could have happened if the horse hadn't took the bullet for Bragg. But
I didn't know Bragg's horse got shot between the eyes.
He did. So anyway, once the Confederate line is holding, it's a stalemate by almost noon. Well, a little bit before noon. It's a stalemate until Lew Wallace makes his move south. And once he hits the Confederate flank, it just starts rolling up. And Beauregard repeatedly, now, even though they're outflanked, they are still holding out. They're still being able to put up a strong defense. It's not over just yet for Beauregard. He can still, he thinks he can still do it. He moves back to the crossroads where they had fought tooth and nail the day before. And they're still holding. But Lew Wallace keeps hitting against the flank, keeps turning. Every time Beauregard sets up a defensive line, Lew Wallace hits that left flank again. And it just happens that repeatedly and repeatedly until Beauregard is now pushed all the way back towards the Shiloh church. His men cannot go any longer. Men are streaming back to the rear with wounds. He can read the writing on the wall. He knows it's not going to look good. It's not looking good. No matter how long you can hold out, that's just the delaying the inevitable, and you may not have an army in the next few hours. And so finally, Beauregard pulls back. The people who stay on the field is Breckinridge's corps, who is the rear guard, making sure that they're just kind of holding off the Union attack. There's one last Confederate attack that happens. Colonel Looney, he's got the 38th Tennessee and a conglomeration of other troops. There's about 1,000 men in this little mishmash group of men that he has cobbled together, and he attacks the Union line for the last time to hopefully hold them back long enough. It's not that great. It doesn't do what Beauregard hoped it would do, but it does hold them off in one small location of the battlefield.
So he was just trying to buy time, or was this a morale booster?
No, this was buying time.
Okay.
And just like Johnston the day before, Beauregard actually led 2 assaults around about noon on the second day. Beauregard actually personally led two assaults against the Union line, hoping to either morale boost and hopefully to stop the Union assault. But again, he's outnumbered by that point. Buell had arrived that night. Lew Wallace had arrived the night of the 6th, morning of the 7th, and also there was another division that was coming from Buell's army, which was General Wood's division. And so the Confederate soldiers, they were commenting that it appeared like appeared like ants crawling out of the ground. They just kept coming at them. It was about impossible for them to do anything else that day. But most military historians contribute that to Beauregard not setting up a proper defensive line the night before. If he had, the Confederates may have been able to hold them off. Again, they still had a lot of fight in them, and even though they were all mixed up all over the battlefield, they still held on for a long time that morning until Lew Wallace turned their flank.
I mean, what happens if Beauregard pulls back and sets up a strong defensive position? And I mean, is Grant's, they don't push him from the field. I mean, is this seen as a major Confederate victory?
No, if that's the case, it's probably more of a stalemate. Although knowing Grant's tenacity, he's not gonna he's not gonna give up that easily. Again, he's got more men and he's got fresher troops. Almost everyone's been engaged on the Confederate side to some extent or the other. He has troops that have not seen battle yet. And even at the end of the battle, there's some troops that didn't fully see the battle. So, what would have happened? Of course, we don't know what would happen. But if Beauregard had actually set up his defensive line, but it would have drastically changed the second day if Beauregard had done that one thing.
So Beauregard does that, and he holds. I mean, how is this going to be played out in the press? I mean, is Northern and Southern papers? I mean, instead of it being seen as a major Confederate defeat, I mean, is this going to be a morale booster for the Confederacy?
Well, it's. Do you mean a morale boost for the Union, or?
No, I mean, well, for both of them, really. I mean, how is it going to be portrayed? I mean, how's it going to play out in the North? I mean, is it going to be seen as, we went down there and we couldn't drive them off? Is the South going to be Confederacy saying, hey, we held our own against this army? I mean, because you're playing a PR game too at this point. You've got fall elections coming up in the North.
Well, the Confederate government, the Confederate people are dismayed that they had lost.
Okay.
Jefferson Davis is confused. You said you won a great victory. He's asking this of Beauregard the day before, and now you're telling me that you've been pushed from the entire field and had to retreat all the way back to Corinth.
I mean, I would think I would be livid. I mean, if I'm thinking, they're thinking I just won a victory, and then the next thing I know, my army's just been, defeated.
Mm-hmm. And the Northern press is, they're happy they've won, but they see at what cost. 25,000 casualties combined. So almost 13,000 casualties for the Union. They call Grant a butcher. There's really nothing he could have done. He did well. He did a wonderful job at Shiloh. Um, but they call for Abraham Lincoln, saying, replace him. We don't want him as commander. He's just a butcher. He's going to kill all of our sons and husbands and fathers. And Lincoln says, I cannot spare this man. He fights. That's exact quote from Abraham Lincoln. And he knows he has, because he's been trying to get McClellan to move since the previous summer. And
Exactly.
or previous fall. I'll correct myself. Previous fall, he's been trying to get McClellan to move, and he hasn't. And so he's not going to replace Grant. He's actually fighting, and he's actually winning. He's won at Fort Henry. He's won at Fort Donelson. He's pushed into Tennessee. He's captured West Tennessee, and he's defeated a Confederate army after being almost defeated the first day. I mean, he's not going to give up on Grant. Grant is his man.
Yeah.
He won't be solidly on Grant's side until Vicksburg, but this is laying the foundation for the relationship between Abraham Lincoln and Ulysses S. Grant. But the
What
battle,
was the statement said about McClellan? If you want, can I at least borrow the army? Or
yeah, if you're not going to use the army, could I at least borrow it? And Lincoln says that McClellan had the slows. And speaking of the slows, Grant actually has the slows after the Battle of Shiloh. Beauregard moves into northern Mississippi to Corinth, and they lick their wounds there. The Union Army don't move against them that quickly. It's a very glacial pace that Grant moves against Corinth. Eventually, he will and force Beauregard away, and Beauregard moves to Tupelo. When he gets to Tupelo, it's a funny story. Beauregard will tell Davis he'd like to have some leave. He's going to go to Bladden Springs in Alabama as kind of like it's a spa. It's a spa to be able to rejuvenate. You have some mineral springs, mineral water, and everything. After 3 days, he hasn't heard anything back from Davis, and before Davis can respond, Beauregard leaves and goes to Bladden Springs, leaving his army there in Tupelo.
where's that at?
It's in southern Alabama.
Okay.
At least that's the modern Bladden Springs. I'm not sure. I was trying to look it up and see if Bladden Springs, maybe there was an
There's ever a
older
lot of
one.
springs here, in Alabama. I'm curious where it might be at.
Google Maps says it's in southern Alabama, so I'm gonna go with that. So he's moved a really long distance. This isn't I'm going down the road 3 miles. No, this is I'm leaving the state, and leaves his army there. Davis is irate, says he removes Beauregard from command and puts Braxton Bragg in command of the Confederate army there.
How pivotal was that?
Say it again.
How pivotal was that decision?
It's gonna decide the rest of the much of the rest of the war in the West.
You think Beauregard could have done better? I mean, sometimes I think Bragg gets a bad rap.
Bragg does get a bad rap. Most of it's brought on himself. But he does. He's not as bad as people make him out to be. He had a lot of detractors, and I think probably the better person to choose to actually put in place out of all the corps commanders that Beauregard had. So he had Hardee, Polk, Bragg, and Breckinridge. Breckinridge had no prior military experience. Polk had dropped out of the army right after leaving West Point. The only 2 other men that would conceivably have wanted to put in command out of that army that was already there was either Hardee or Bragg.
Right.
So I mean, it's half of the men. Bragg is one of those top men. He performed well in the Mexican-American War, especially as an artillery commander. But Hardee literally wrote the books on infantry tactics and how to perform. Yeah, I mean that's what the Civil War armies used was Hardee's tactics.
Yeah, that's right. I remember reading that.
And so I think
reading that he wrote that.
I think a better choice would have been probably Hardee. Hardee doesn't get much love from many people. He didn't have. I don't think he had the chance to kind of show what he had, but he probably would have been a better choice than Bragg. But again, Bragg's not as bad as people make him out to be. I've got a video all about that. So that's stating that.
Didn't Hardee? Wasn't he the commander that was supposed to attack Peachtree Creek and waited 8 hours, or was that Cheatham?
I'd have to go back and look. I can't remember right off the top of my head.
Yeah, because I remember because Hood had ordered this attack, and they was numerically even, and I thought it was, I don't remember off the top of my head, but I thought one of them waited 8 hours to attack, and it was too late by then. I couldn't.
Well, you brought up Cheatham. That is one commander on either side that I absolutely can't stand.
Really,
I think he's one of the worst ones that the Confederate Army had. I would put him almost as bad as Bragg, or worse than Bragg, in my opinion, simply because let's take Shiloh. After the first day, he marches his men all the way back to his bivouac position the day before. I mean, he's not even on the battlefield when the Union Army starts to move. That's ridiculous. And then at Stones River, Cheatham is drunk during that first day.
Really?
Leading his men. I absolutely can't stand Cheatham. Just from a personal standpoint. Just what kind of idiot are you to be to do what he did in some of these battles? So no, I do not like Cheatham.
He moved his men back to the bivouac just because that's where he spent the night, and then he was drunk.
He was drunk the first day at Stones River, yeah.
I mean, what? Yeah, that's horrible.
But yeah, that's the situation. Once the Confederate Army moves to Tupelo, after Grant has finally moved enough forces down towards Corinth to actually capture it. Now the Confederate Army is in Tupelo. It's now under Braxton Bragg, and Chattanooga is being threatened. And so the Confederate Army will be transported from Tupelo down to Mobile. From Mobile, they'll go across the Pearl River, get on a train, head up to Montgomery, then go to Atlanta, then go to Chattanooga. That very circuitous route of railroad to Chattanooga, and then they will start the Kentucky campaign soon afterwards.
Wow, that's interesting. They went from Tupelo to Mobile to, you said Atlanta?
To Montgomery, then Atlanta, then Chattanooga.
Huh. And how many troops was this that was?
Bragg's part of the army that they leave Tupelo with is a little bit smaller than it's around 40,000 men that he's moving across by train to Chattanooga.
Huh. Because often, I'm ashamed that I didn't know this. I guess because so much emphasis is put on the Eastern Theater. Yeah, I just thought that they fell back into Vicksburg, and I didn't realize really that's how they got to Chattanooga. And I often wonder, what happened after Shiloh? That answers a lot of questions there for me.
Yeah, there's a Confederate force that's left in northern Mississippi. We'll get the Battle of Iuka. That'll happen a little bit later. But Mississippi's got its own force that's kind of patrolling it. Bragg takes the major force to Chattanooga because Chattanooga is the railroad hub, and he will come together with Edmund Kirby Smith and decide they're going to invade Kentucky, and they will do that in August and September of 1862.
Is this not the time now? Because I've made this argument, and people still say I've made a compelling one to give up Vicksburg. I mean, it's worthless at this point. You don't have New Orleans. You don't have anything. You can't control that river.
Well, at this point, we're talking about April and May and June of 1862. Mm-hmm. The Union don't have all of the forces. Oh, they don't have all of the Mississippi River captured yet, or at least not most. Not the greatest portion. You're right. They got New Orleans, and they're moving south towards Memphis. So the Confederates still have control of more or less the border between Mississippi, the western border of Mississippi, and the Mississippi River.
But when the Confederates lost New Orleans, it becomes worthless at that point, because you're not getting anything. You're not getting anything out of there, and you're not getting any supplies in if you don't control New Orleans. I mean, how they did not defend that port right there is beyond me.
Well, Timothy B. Smith, who wrote a wonderful, it's probably the best book on the Battle of Shiloh. It's what I
Mhm.
used for all my animated battle maps. He kind of puts forward that the Battle of Shiloh determines the Mississippi River,
Okay.
even though it doesn't even take place near the Mississippi River. That battle decides the fate of the Mississippi River because now the major Confederate army in the West, they leave after Shiloh. Again, they go to Chattanooga.
Right.
This opens up Grant having his campaign against Vicksburg. And so the Battle of Shiloh, even though it doesn't take place near the Mississippi River, it actually allows the Mississippi River to be captured even more fully, and Grant has an easier time than he would have had if let's say the Confederate army in the West would have stayed in northern Mississippi and harassed him from there.
So what this author is saying is that the Confederates should have um, God, trying to say, consolidated, concentrated. The Confederates should have reconcentrated and stayed in Mississippi and made
He
Grant fight for every inch to Vicksburg.
he doesn't come out and say that. As far as he goes, is that the Mississippi River was contested at Shiloh, and if the control of if Grant could have been thwarted at Shiloh, he wouldn't have been sent on campaign against Vicksburg and the Mississippi River. He had still had to contend with force he had left against the Confederate army that's in the West. But
I mean,
because
let's just say
go ahead.
that he still has that victory at Shiloh, but they concentrate. I mean, they put another 40,000 men in the field instead of going to Chattanooga and make him pay for every inch of ground that they take. I mean, they may not ever get to Vicksburg.
Mm-hmm. And after that battle, after the Battle of Shiloh, Grant does start his moving towards Vicksburg, and Buell will move towards Nashville. So the Union Army will split, and Buell will go after Bragg into Kentucky while Grant is moving through Mississippi.
I mean, that was such a beautiful chess move, the way he moves through Mississippi, that they just sat there and let him do that.
Oh, it's incredible. I really think most people do not give Grant the credit that he is due. He's one of the better
No, they don't.
tacticians and one of the best strategists that the Civil War ever produced, and possibly even the greatest that the Civil War produced.
Yeah, I mean, I
He,
get tired of him.
he's
I
incredible.
always defend Grant. When,
Grant was incredible, and his resolve is probably one of the best of any. The simple statement on the night of April 6th, 1862, that after him and Sherman talk, and Sherman says, we've had a rough day, and Grant says, whip them tomorrow, though. I mean, that makes cold chills go down my arms, because that shows how tough Grant was and how much confidence he had in his own army. And he had a lot of
yeah,
confidence in it.
I get aggravated at people when they attack Grant and call him, butcher, because he sustained a lot of casualties because he had the resources and he used them. And people hate when I do this, but I use it like a football analogy. I remember back when those Nebraska teams of Tom Aldrin, big physical running teams, and they play like a Missouri. And Missouri would, field a decent team. They'd have 11 good players, and the game would be like 13-6 at half, and 16-6 going in the fourth quarter. But then the final score would be 45-6, and that's what I compare it to Grant. He just kept on with those resources like that, and that does not make him a bad commander because he utilized the forces that he had. That's what he's supposed to do.
Well, and I'll throw in this: Grant did not waste troops. Most people, when they say that, point toward the overland campaign in Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
I can see where they're coming from. He did. He threw a lot of troops in there, but we can't forget his maneuverability. He keeps moving.
Right.
He's not just throwing men up against a brick wall. He may throw them against a brick wall, but he realizes, oh, there's a wall there. Let's go around. Another wall, go around. Another wall, go around. He just keeps
Right.
moving, and he does the same thing at Vicksburg. Vicksburg is not a. There might be some historians that argue with me on this. It wasn't a bloody campaign compared to other
No.
campaigns,
Right.
and so if you want to call him a butcher, you're going to have to take his entire military career as a whole and not just focus on the overland campaign, because the Vicksburg campaign clearly illustrates he's willing to spare his men. I mean, he tries to divert the Mississippi River in order to get
Right.
around Vicksburg. That's not a man who's a butcher. That's a man who's using the environment against the enemy. And Earl Hess, the probably the greatest Civil War military historian alive today, says that the reason the Union won it and the reason Grant was so good was because he was able to use technology to its fullest extent. He
Hmm.
was the one that
Yeah.
he's the one that used the steamboats and was
Uh-huh.
able to defeat the Confederates using steam power through boats and through the
Huh.
railroads. He's moving troops. He's moving troops by water and rail. He's using telegraph wires. This man is. There was
Interesting.
there was a discussion on Facebook on one of the civil. I think no, it was actually on the American History Fanatics. If you're part of that group,
I'll
and
have to join that.
someone asked, what commander today, if you could have a military commander of all American forces today, who would you choose? And there's a couple listed there, and of course, a lot of people picked Patton, and I
Mhm.
picked Grant. And people was like, "Why would you pick Grant?" I was like, "For one simple reason. Grant is not because Grant is so in touch with technology, he is not going to try to go toe to toe with any country with manpower as much as he will with technology. He's the one that's going to be using computers and technology to shut down their economies if that happens.
Huh.
So uh, I would pick Grant over anyone in history to lead an army today because of him being in touch with technology so much.
That's an interesting concept right there that I've never even considered or thought about him. Because I mean, people call it the first modern war, but I didn't realize how instrumental Grant was. At
He
least,
was.
like that you just pointed out, moving troops with boats and trains and telegraph wires. I mean, communication. We talked about that so many times. Is so important, and for him to utilize those telegraph wires, I mean, it's so instrumental.
Yeah, I don't think, again, people don't give Grant enough credit for the way he's able to conduct himself in warfare. And most people focus on the Eastern Theater. And again, I'm a Western Theater man. And I learned from Earl Hess, the man, like I said, he's probably the greatest Civil War military historian living today. And I took a Civil War class under him, and I graduated with my bachelor's writing my senior writing requirement for him. He's the one who turned me towards the Western Theater, and I've never looked back. And he's spot on.
I mean, do you think that
Grant is using the technology against the Confederate forces and winning easily.
when he got sent to the East, that he had to go after Lee just from a psychological standpoint because Lee had been beating everybody in beating them badly, and he had to go after him even if he sustained casualties just for a psychological standpoint. I'm going to beat this guy.
He had to change strategies that the other Union forces hadn't, and he didn't move too differently than what he had done previously. Again, when he ran into a problem towards Vicksburg, if he could go around it, he did. As long as it wasn't going to hurt his army, he was just going to go around the problem. And the Confederate army, if Lee was going to stand there, he was going to go around it and hit him from a different direction. And that changed the entire dynamic of the war in the East. No one had given Lee that kind of um, obstacle before.
Yeah, I mean, I've pointed out that Lee knew after the wilderness because any other commander would have moved back above the river. That he took Lee out of his element because now Lee was forced to defend instead of maneuver.
Yeah, Grant. When Grant takes command in the East, people are telling him, "You got to watch out for this. You got to watch out for that." Lee'll do this. You just watch him. And he says, "We need to stop worrying what Lee's going to do to us, and we need to worry about what we're going to do to him." And I think that again illustrates what kind of man that Grant was.
Well, I remember he made some statement too about after the wilderness, and and that gets so frustrating because people try to change that battle. I mean, when you go back and look at what the papers said at the time, it was viewed as a major Confederate victory. But Grant said something about him doing cartwheels and somersaults. Because they had two great flank attacks that day.
Well, I think I know the quote you're talking about. He's talking with many of the commanders there in the East. And he's like, talking to you, you'd think that Lee was going to do a couple somersaults and jump and fall in our rear and
Yeah,
and attack us from there. Um, I think Grant was a realist. He's like, Lee's just a man. We can defeat him with manpower.
yeah. I mean, he knew that, and that's the thing that I get people, say this is part of the lost cause when they put in overwhelming resources. Look, that was a contributing factor in the North winning the war. Grant utilized that. I mean, people can't ignore that.
No, I think Shiloh. I mean, we see that Fort Henry and Fort Donelson puts Grant on the map. Shiloh endears him to Abraham Lincoln, and this lays the foundation for Grant's ascent into the high ranks of the Union Army and eventually the presidency. Grant is that good, and Shiloh proves it because while he's telling Sherman, McClernand, Prentiss, Hurlbut, W.H.L. Wallace, telling them, "Buy me some time, and I'll put up a defensive line, and we can stay safe. But you've got to buy me some time." And it's Grant and his staff who are putting all this defensive line together. Grant is exhausted by that first day, and a kind of a funny anecdotal story, not funny at the time, of course, but Grant's a little squeamish of blood, and his headquarters have basically been taken over by a hospital, and he just has to leave the situation because he can't bear to deal with all that happening around him.
Really, I didn't know that.
Yeah, and also during the battle, I forget exactly what happened now, but anyway, someone next to him gets their brain matter blasted all over Grant, and he's having to wipe blood and brain matter off
Oh
of him.
God.
And I mean, knowing Grant had, I'm not saying he had a weak stomach, but he didn't. It wasn't
Well, yeah, I
pleasant for
mean,
him to have to deal with. That would affect anybody, no matter how
yeah,
how much you've seen.
that's not good. Yeah, it makes me sick of that. So I want to ask you. We had a discussion on that, and about Lee or Johnston being the Lee of the West. Chris made a statement that he didn't think Lee would perform as well in the West as he did in the East, and he had a good point he made. In the East, Lee was essentially blocked into 2 or 3 counties, and after he would win, he would maneuver. He would have a lot more territory to cover in the West. But at the same time, would he have more territory, more room to maneuver?
I think that worked for his benefit when he was in Virginia, that he didn't have that much space to deal with.
Okay.
And the space he did have, he maximized. In the West is a completely different animal. You've got a range of over 400-mile front that the Confederacy is
Mhm.
having to defend in the state of basically the border between Kentucky and Tennessee. And then you've got it just as much deep, over 400 miles deep, all the way to the Gulf. How are you going to defend all that territory? Yeah, he's got plenty of places to maneuver, but that means you've got to cover a lot of land if you're going to be trying to attack different Union forces that are invading the region. And again, that's why this moves back to what we originally were discussing with Davis having setting up the departmental system, where ideally, if a Union force came in, you would concentrate a force, defeat it, and then disperse again. It didn't work to that extent because you couldn't coordinate these huge groups.
Right.
the time we see, the only significant coordination that we see is the Kentucky campaign, and that was
Hmm.
a failure because neither Bragg nor Kirby Smith wanted to work together that well. Each one wanted to assert their command over their troops, and so Kirby Smith doesn't even make it to the battle, or doesn't even come to the Battle of Perryville. That is the culmination of the Kentucky campaign. So it doesn't work.
That's horrible. I mean, not to have you have to have a central commander. I don't understand that logic. I guess that goes with the Confederacy, the Confederation of States.
It, it's a it is a weird command structure, and to say that I understand it completely, I'd be lying. But when Kirby Smith and Bragg are moving into Kentucky, it's technically seniority is supposed to prevail.
Right.
But the way Jefferson Davis kind of explained it to each man was that each one had independent command, that they must work together, but they had independent command, and they took it to the extreme. And that,
Right.
sorry, you're not going to tell me where to go.
Yeah,
But
I'm not listening to you.
now,
You're coming to help me.
to defend Bragg, he was trying to work with Smith. He gave Smith 2 brigades to invade Kentucky in his section. I mean, he was trying to work with Smith, but Smith was not interested in working with Bragg. And once they leave Kentucky and come back, Smith will trash talk Bragg in Richmond to Jefferson Davis. Smith will be sent to the Trans-Mississippi Department after that.
um, I mean, in the system too. I mean, when did he make Joseph Johnston the commander of the West, but essentially he had no troops?
That was right before the Battle of Stones River.
Okay.
Right before Stones River. So
Well, he had command, but he
December,
didn't.
yeah, December of '62.
Okay.
Johnson
So
had some troops, but yeah, you're right. He didn't have that many
yeah, he had
troops.
like 5,000 troops or something. And he was like the overall commander. I was like, how is he the overall commander? And he has, but he has no troops under his command because he was ordering Pemberton to abandon Vicksburg.
I was just reading a little bit on the Battle of Stones River, and right after Stones River,
Okay.
Bragg is seen as incompetent. He's lost another battle for the Confederacy. He's retreated. He's retreated to Oklahoma. Sorry, Johnston takes over command right after, so early '63, takes over right after Stones River because it's Bragg that people's like, we need to replace Bragg, and so Jefferson Davis sends Johnston west. Doesn't put him over command of the army. However, there is a critical moment right after the Battle of Stones River where Johnston is sent west. Johnston comes to the Army of Tennessee in Tullahoma, and he's supposed to send Bragg to Richmond to discuss things with Davis, essentially putting Johnston in command of the Army of Tennessee.
Mm-hmm.
Not because Bragg would be gone.
Right.
It would go to Johnston until he returned. Um, the author didn't fully explain it, so I'm a little fuzzy. I haven't got a chance to dive a little deeper. I just read it 2 days ago. But apparently,
Okay.
Mrs. Bragg was with Braxton at Tullahoma at this point, and she had probably a fit with some typhoid fever at the moment. And
Really?
Johnston didn't want to send Bragg away because he would be sending him away from his wife. What would have been if, we can always ask the what ifs. What would have been if Mrs. Bragg hadn't been sick and Bragg had been sent to Richmond to discuss things with Jefferson Davis and Johnston take over command of the Confederate forces there, even if it was just for a short while? What would have happened? We don't know, but that was just a really neat moment that I was kind of fixated on, of that has a huge what if to accompany it.
I mean, but see, I think that Joseph Johnston is one of the most overrated commanders of the Civil War. I think he maybe had a good plan about abandoning Vicksburg, but I mean, he was just going to keep falling back. They say the final battle when we fought the Florida Keys.
Possibly,
I
you never know.
And people say, "Oh, well, Grant spoke highly of him." Oh, yeah, he spoke highly of him. The guy gave up half of Georgia in 60 days.
I think Johnston's another one that gets a bad reputation. Of course, he's pulling back, but you also have to understand that Johnston, I think he was more of a natural defensive fighter anyway. And he knew that if he was going to keep his army intact, he was going to have to fight a defensive war instead of launching these assaults. And we see plain as day by late 63 and 64, these assaults that Lee orders, that Hood will order in 64, they end up just destroying the armies. It's not a good thing to be launching these offensives when you can't replace the men when you're fighting. And so the better strategy would be Johnston's.
I see the people's point on it, but he almost lost Richmond to McClellan of all people, for God's sakes. He almost gave up the capital without firing a shot, and they were numerically even. Mm-hmm. So I understand people saying when they talk about Johnston's strategy later on, but and I think about Bentonville. Oh, now you want to attack? You just gave up, half the state when you had, 60,000 men, and now you're down to 17,000. It's not even really that on paper, and you're going to attack a force of 80,000 men.
Every time I hear the name Joseph E. Johnston, for some reason my mind always goes to Robert E. Lee and him in a picture together, and they're old men. It's in a very old picture. Have you seen that picture before?
I actually have that picture in our moderator group. That's the picture that's for when we our moderator team.
I just love that picture because can you imagine what those two men talked about and what those men saw?
If you look closely at the picture, Johnston's demeanor, you can tell that he's not really receiving Lee too warmly.
I don't know. I'd have to study the picture a little bit more to catch that.
It, because I've studied the picture a lot. I've read people on it, and they actually some people have talked about that Lee's earlobes, and I didn't even know this was a factor, but he had these creases that they could tell, and supposedly with the type of heart disease he had, that is one of the symptoms. People get these weird creases in their ears, and they point that out in that picture. But next time you're looking at it, because Johnston's like looking away, and Lee died in 1870. So these men aged rapidly.
Oh yes, he did.
You look at Lee from, he looked, 85 years old then.
Yeah, that picture. Well, Johnston looks old too in that, and again, it's only been 5 years since the war ended, but we can see can see the effect that war has on people.
These guys were, basically aging in dog years.
Mm-hmm.
They just looked, and I don't even remember how old Johnston was. Lee was only 63 when he died. That was probably a lot older in those times than what it is today, but still he looks bad. And that was, one of the things that I read when Lee first took over was, they were talking about how handsome he was and what kind of physique the man had.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, he was a pretty boy.
Yeah, I heard one of the best books I ever read about him was The Gray Fox, and they they told they had several of his love letters that he had written to his girlfriends, but one of the interesting things that touched on was they claimed that Lee was a chubby chaser. Have you ever
Well,
heard that?
you need to watch my video, Robert E. Lee, the Playboy.
Okay,
I
I've
talk
not seen
about
that one.
I talk about a lot of that, and just his love life and his flirtations in that. And so I think your answer will be in that video.
Okay, do you have it in there? He had where he written. I mean, you know what he's talking about. He wrote that old girlfriend and asked her about going off like a firecracker on the 4th of July.
That story is in that video. Yes, it is.
Okay, I will have to. I'll have to look at that because when I first read that, I mean, I busted out laughing when I heard that, and then I started reading, more about that. He was like you said, he was a playboy.
He
And
was.
people, yeah. I mean, I guess because I'd never, when I started really studying the man, when you're a Southerner, young Southerner, you see Lee is almost like a deity. You don't see it as the whole complexity of that he was a man. And then once I started looking at him in a different light, I got a whole new viewpoint of the complexity of the man.
Mhm. Yeah,
I mean,
he's he's
because
he's he's like anybody else. He's a lot more complicated than people take it. People consider.
yeah, I mean, and yeah, I mean, I think he gets because my thing somebody had posted about him, and I challenged a lot of the statements that they made because they talked about Lee the slave owner. And I said, well, he did inherit one slave, but I said I don't think until he inherited those slaves in 1857, he had that many. I said, and how was he owning a bunch of slaves when he was all over the world, in the army? And they had the thing about when he supposedly ordered a slave to be whipped and brined. I said that story only came like from third-hand accounts. Nobody actually said that. So you have to take. I think Lee. He was not a deity, and he was not the demon that people make him out to be. I mean, you have to take the whole complexity of the individual.
Like I said, with Grant, with anyone, you got to look at them holistically. And there's plenty of books out there that do that. You just have to find the right one.
Because people have to realize, and this is such a touchy subject, but slavery was legal in the United States up to that point.
Yeah, I mean it was.
I mean, and people don't want to address that, but and I think that sometimes the Southern leadership are made to pay for all the sins of slavery throughout history. But I mean, it was legal in the United States, and had they actually took this to the court system, we may be having a whole different conversation right now instead of them starting a shooting war.
It's them what ifs.
Yeah, I mean, because you look at the Dred Scott decision just a few years before. I mean, if they would have filed, I mean, who knows how the Supreme Court might have ruled that they could secede.
I like I said, don't know about that, but that's like I said, it's them what ifs that we can't figure
Yeah, I
out
mean,
because it's just not don't know all the situations.
yeah, I mean, I would have to go back and look at who. I mean, was the Supreme Court still the same as when the Dred Scott decision was made, or had other members been replaced? I mean, who was actually on the Supreme Court? That would go a long way with how that decision played out. I mean, it's hard for me to think that the Supreme Court would have, basically told the United States that they could break up if they wanted to, but they're essentially cutting their own throats. But who knows what they would do? Because they'd already assumed so much power.
Yeah, the Southern slave power was losing power
I'm
in
talking
Congress
Supreme
and the
Court.
Senate. Oh yeah, but they
Yeah,
were losing.
that's
They was losing power in Congress, so they were having. Well, they were. That's one reason the Civil War breaks out is they were lashing out against them losing political power.
yeah, and I mean, I, I tell people this all the time because people will say, people. I think it's funny. I either get called a lost causer or somebody called me a high priest in the Church of Lincoln, and I said, I can't be both. You got to pick one. Um, and I said, look, just own it, okay? The Southern aristocracies, the slaves were worth, I think, $22 trillion in today's economy. They wasn't letting that go without a fight, okay?
Yeah, it's when you talk about the Civil War in its early stages, we have to factor in a whole lot of things. But when we look at it politically, the Congress, Senate, Southern politicians were losing power. What was called the dough faces, those Northerners who were Northern Democrats who were allowing slaveocracy to kind of push them around in Congress, were turning their backs on the South, and that scared a lot of Southern politicians, and they see secession as the only thing viable. But
Yeah, and I was having a discussion, we had a discussion about that, and somebody made a good point and this was actually a pro-unionist. He said that if the South wanted to secede, they should have waited until Lincoln's term was over. You can't just, quit because you lose an election. That's not how it works. And I was like, I thought that was a really interesting concept to come up with. If you wanted to leave, you would have, you can try it after his term's over with, but, he would won the presidency and he was the president.
yeah, I mean, well, that's if you read Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, he essentially says that same thing. He's like, you can't leave just because you lost an election. Democracies don't work that way. You know what? 4 years, vote me out. But until then, you can't leave. That's just not how the government works.
Yeah, I mean, and I've made that statement basically somebody one time that, I I mean, I actually agree with what I mean. If I was Lincoln, I would do the same thing. My God, I'm the president, and you're not going to leave just because you don't like it because I won. This, you're not leaving. If I have to force you in by the bayonet, then that's what I'm going to do.
Yeah, Lincoln is going to be. He wants to be president of all the United States, not just a
Yeah,
part of them.
I mean, yeah, I mean, he won. He won the election. I mean, I wouldn't. I would have, let him. You can't just do whatever the hell you want to do because you lost an election. Um, like I said, I mean that's not how it works. And um, and and it's interesting too. I did a post in the moderator group. I was actually, I was playing like I said, could you imagine what um, the Confederates presidential election would look like? And I did like a CNN with Wolf Blitzer. I said, you had you'd have a Beauregard, a man of the people. Lee campaigned with Jefferson Davis right outside of Petersburg last week, and breaking news. Because I was actually, what I was basically getting at was, who would have replaced Davis? A lot of people think Lee would have been the natural selection. I don't. I mean, first of all, I think he was too sick to take the job, and I don't think he wanted to be a politician. So who would have, been the next generation of leaders if the Confederacy had won?
I don't know. You'd have to assume that many of the generals would, and
Yeah,
many
that's
of
what
them
I would
did. If
think.
if they got wounded, many of them just went into politics or took a governmental job.
I mean, I would think that Longstreet, if they had won, he would have been, one of the leaders. I don't think Lee was capable physically. So if tickets if his reputation had been different. I mean, it's really hard to say because when you look at the leaders, I mean, one of the fire eaters, the major ones from Alabama, Thigpen, he died in 1863. So, a lot of the older ones was already dying off.
Yeah, the southern fire eaters are many of them are extreme anyway, and that's why
Right.
they chose men like Alexander Stevens and Jefferson Davis, is because even though they were somewhat pro-secession, they were more moderate than the fire eaters.
I mean, the Stevens was, I mean, I don't know, just from the picture, he looks very old when he became vice president.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I guess Breckinridge would probably be high on that list. I mean, since he was, vice president. And,
at the end of the war, he becomes Secretary of War.
Right. Yes, I mean, I think that, he would have been, a natural. And probably, I mean, James Seddon was the Secretary of War, I believe. And even, I think Brack was the Secretary of War.
He was a consultant to
okay.
Jefferson Davis.
That's right. He was, and then I think he got sent back and was a corps commander up under Johnston, wasn't he? At the end.
I don't
I can't remember.
know right off the top of my head.
Now that I think about it, I think I remember reading about him being on one of the trains when they left Richmond. So maybe he wasn't in the field at the end of the war.
I hate to stop you, Chris. I'm gonna have to go. I've got to get to bed.
Oh, I'm sorry, man. I get to start talking this. I can go all night, but I'll get this up soon. And I enjoyed the chat, and I guess 2 weeks. We'll talk about Corinth, or
we can talk about Corinth and maybe Iuka.
Okay.
To talk about that.
I don't know much about Iuka at all. So that'd be interesting.
Let's do that in 2 weeks. Let's see. Let me look at my schedule here.
Yeah, well, how's your dissertation?
Yeah, I formatted it, and let's see, in 2 weeks. The next 2 weeks, I'm going to be completely booked up because I'm going to Philadelphia next week and presenting at a conference.
Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, or Mississippi?
Pennsylvania.
Okay.
And then 2 days later, I'm going to Mississippi to defend the dissertation. So these next 2 weeks, I'm traveling halfway across the country multiple times. So,
well, man, that's
so we will shoot for the week of the 28th and 29th of March.
Okay, that's perfect. Because end of April, I'm going to New Orleans for the weekend, so I'm looking.
I'm jealous.
I'm looking forward to that. I've never had a bad time in New Orleans. It's a fun place. I lived in New Iberia for a while. That's about halfway between New Orleans and Lafayette, and that's when I realized, what the term coon ass really was. It was not a racist term. I thought it was. I was selling trailers down there, and this woman came in on a lot, and I could not get her in the office. And if I can't get somebody in the office, I can't make a sale. And I couldn't figure it out. And I was like, well, just come in here for just a minute. No, I really like this, but I got to leave. I said, well, just come here and talk to me for a minute. No. I was like, why not? She goes, somebody ran over this turtle, and I picked it up, and I got to go home and make gumbo. He had picked up roadkill and was fixing to go home and make gumbo out of it. And my friend who got me the job went there, he was from Louisiana. He said, that's where the term coon ass comes from. He said, you just So I told that my friend last night. He'd never heard it before. And he was like, what? I was like, yeah, you never heard that term before? He said, no. I said, yeah. I said, it's not as bad. It's not as bad as what it sounds. Because I mean, I love Louisiana. I mean, it is a different breed of people. From the food, the liquor, They had let's see, Edwin Edwards. He was one of my favorite politicians. He was governor of Louisiana. God, I don't know how many times. And they had a show a few years ago called The Governor's Wife, and he was like 90 years old and trying to father another child. But he finally got convicted. They put this man on trial like 6 or 7 times, and he did. And he made the statement. He said, "The only way I could get convicted in Louisiana is if they found me in bed with a dead woman or a live boy." But okay, man, let me know how that goes, and we'll look at talking about that at the end of March.
That sounds great, buddy. I look forward to it.
All right, man. Have a good one.
You too. Bye.
Bye.